When it comes to the failings of an oil company, you probably think of an environmental devastation. But what if it also has led to the killing of innocent people? The oil company Shell is accused of just that. According to Amnesty International, the firm's executives encouraged a brutal crackdown to silence protesters in the Nigerian region of Ogoniland. During the 1990s, protesters campaigned to protect their homeland. But according to leaked Shell documents, the company was pushing the military to end the demonstrations. Several activists were allegedly raped and tortured and executed, including author Ken Saro Wiwa. Well, the Newsmakers invited Shell onto the program. They declined, but sent us this statement. We have always denied in the strongest possible terms the allegations made in this tragic case. The executions of Ken Saro Wiwa and his fellow Ogonis in 1995 were tragic events that were carried out by the military government in power at the time. Now, you can read the full statement on our Facebook page. Well, joining me now from London is Mark Dummett. He's a researcher at Amnesty International. He's also the co-author of the report accusing Shell of human rights abuses in Nigeria. Mark, good to have you on the program. That's what they say, and it's a great tragedy that they didn't want to come onto the show to debate, but they've put out their statement. You heard what they had to say. Does any of that sound reasonable to you?
Well, Shell never really wants to debate these issues. They never really want to go into the details. The company's very comfortable in issuing fairly blanket denials, but not really looking exactly what happened at the time and responding in detail to our allegations and the allegations of others. My colleagues and I have been looking at Shell's role in this brutal crackdown by the Nigerian military in Ogoniland in the 1990s for much of the past year. And we think the evidence is fairly strong that Shell executives, as you said, encouraged this campaign. And that's why we are calling for criminal investigations here in the UK and also in the Netherlands, which is where Shell is headquartered, because we think that, after so long, the truth should come out and people should be held accountable.
What if they were unaware of the scale of the crackdown? What if, yes, they did encourage the military and said, hey, we need to look after our own interests, we're coming under attack, these protesters are disrupting business and they're making life difficult for us, please sort it out. But they were unaware of the methodology and the extent of the brutality. Is that plausible?
It's totally implausible. The scale of the military crackdown was well known and widely reported on by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Greenpeace, with some of the international organizations. The media internationally reported very widely on this brutal crackdown, which lasted several years in Ogoniland. There's absolutely no way that Shell, one of the world's largest and most powerful organizations, didn't know what was going on. And in fact, the documents that we have seen, which were released as part of legal proceedings in the US, show that executives in Nigeria knew perfectly well what was happening and were in fact informing their superiors here in London and in The Hague. So there's absolutely no doubt that Shell knew that the Nigerian military was responsible for extremely grave human rights violations in Ogoniland in response to these protests.
Would it be difficult to actually open this up again, because not only would you be putting Shell on trial, but also the Nigerian military, because ultimately they would have done the killing, not Shell?
Right, good question. I mean, obviously the people who were directly responsible for these human rights violations were the Nigerian military. No one's accusing Shell staff or executives of being involved in actually what was happening on the ground. Obviously, the perfect scenario would be for justice to be done within Nigeria. But, in the past 23 years, that just hasn't happened. And so that's why, and it's not just in this case, but in other cases involving Shell around pollution, that's why Nigerians have been forced to come to the UK and the Netherlands to try and seek justice in the courts here, because the avenues for justice in Nigeria, unfortunately and sadly, are closed.
Right. Widows of the executed filed a writ against Shell in the Netherlands. Are you going to be piggybacking on that? Are you going to be, sort of adding to that Tell me what's happening with that particular case and if they have any chance of that going to trial.
Right, so that's a civil claim. There are 4 women whose husbands were executed following an unfair trial. They were involved in the protests against Shell. They're suing Shell in the Netherlands. As you say, they filed a writ in June. We support that case, and it's really prompted by that we decided to re-examine all of the evidence. And actually, we're often asked, well, why now? Why are you looking at this now after so much time? Well, Amnesty has been calling for justice for the victims of this crackdown in Ogoniland since the 1990s, but we were prompted to re-examine the evidence by this case that was launched in June. Those women are calling for compensation, but also a public apology from Shell, which is hugely important to them, to these women. We think that the evidence is stronger than just their case, however, which is why we're calling for this criminal investigation as well as this civil case.
Did you hear what Andrew Brown had to say to Stephen Saro recently?
Yes, I did. This was at the Cambridge University,
right,
in which Andrew Brown, who's a senior executive of Shell, said that he was very proud of working for Shell and was responsible for operations in Nigeria.
Yeah, so he goes, executive committee, and Stephen Saro asks him if he was proud of what Shell had done or his work with Shell in Nigeria. And he said, quote, I'm fundamentally proud of what happened in Nigeria. So let's just put this into context, right? We reached out to them. We tried very hard to get them on the program, either for a debate with you or someone else, or as a one-on-one, even if they didn't want to debate. They refused. They sent us a statement, and it's worded very similarly to other statements they sent to other media outlets. And then you have Andrew Brown saying, hey, we're proud of what we've done in Nigeria. So when you hear all of that and you put all of that together, what does that tell you about what Shell thinks of all of these claims and whether they take it seriously?
What I generally feel about Shell's response, as I said, is 2 things really. Firstly, they never really want to discuss the details. They're afraid of being pinned down by the details, I feel personally. In the past, I've challenged them over their record, and my colleagues at Amnesty have challenged them over their record on the environment, all these oil spills which take place in Nigeria. And again, they issue fairly generic replies saying that denying the allegations that they're negligent. But when we actually ask them about specific spills and specific incidents and locations, they shy away from the details. So that's one way in which I recognise one pattern in the standard Shell response. The other thing is they don't like talking about the past. They always want to talk about the future. And no doubt Shell individuals, are proud of where they think the company is going. But we feel that they can't ignore the past. They can't ignore what happened in Nigeria in the 1990s. And I also think, we also think that the responsible governments, so, the government of the UK, of the Netherlands, of Nigeria shouldn't ignore what happened in the past in Ogoniland. And when you talk to Ogonis, the wounds are still very, very raw. It's like it happened yesterday. These are issues that need to be resolved, and justice needs to be done.
And it's, I guess, worth reminding our viewers that the protests began as a result of environmental degradation and spills, right? That's the very reason they rose up and decided to protest against Shell and wanted them kicked out. So that happened at the beginning, and then down the line, people end up dead. So it's kind of an entire sort of beginning, middle, and end here, isn't it?
Right, exactly, and the pollution has still never been cleaned up. I mean, Shell has never returned to Ogoniland. Following the protest, the communities there have never allowed them to return. But, the problems, as you said, that forced them to rise up, the pollution, but also the unfair distribution of the wealth that comes from the oil. Those issues have still never been resolved. And I don't know if you saw, there was a study which was reported quite widely a few weeks ago, talking about the high mortality rate in the Niger Delta of newborn babies, who are born close to spill sites. So, the environmental record and the appalling levels of pollution have a direct and appallingly negative impact on the people living there. And unfortunately, these haven't been resolved. Now, Ken Saro Wiwa, the leader of these protests, provided an opportunity for Nigeria and Shell and the other oil companies to deal with these issues peacefully. But instead, the Nigerian military decided to crack down, and they've still never addressed those underlying root causes.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary report. Mark, I congratulate you on some of the findings. It's extraordinary reading. Mark Drummond joining us from Amnesty International. I thank you very much for joining us.